I'm Scott Fairbanks, Chief Operating Officer for First American NHD, JCP LGS, and one of your trail guides for Camp Out 2022. The recent focus on AB 38 wildfire zones and insurance availability has taken the oxygen out of the room at the expense of other pressing disclosure issues. Of course, wildfire disclosure is extremely important, but it's only one part of the broader issue of natural hazards triggered by climate change, all of which threaten our homes, our resources, and our transactions. So today, we're going to address some of the other climate change hazards that are nibbling at the edges of California's coastal and inland communities with our First American and JCP LGS geologist, Patrick McClellan.
Hey, Scott, thanks for the invite. Happy to be here for the annual Camp Out.
So, Pat, you're one of the few fixtures in the NHD industry. Your name and face are familiar to a lot of established agents and brokers in real estate. They've seen your geologic hazard presentations in offices throughout California, and your webinars and videos have been viewed thousands of times. But younger agents and professionals who are just getting into real estate want to know, who is Patrick McClellan?
Well, sure. I'm a geologist by training with a graduate degree from UC Berkeley. I spent the first half of my career with the U.S. Geological Survey, and for a few years I chaired the geology department of a Bay Area college. I've published peer-reviewed science articles in the fields of geology, earthquake hazards and prediction, paleontology, and even biology. I'm a licensed professional geologist. I've been registered with the state of California for nearly 40 years, and I've been in the NHD industry for over 25 years, all of that time with First American and JCP LGS and their NHD predecessor, JCP. And I'm the only registered geologist in the NHD industry.
Come on, Pat, you're an interesting guy. Don't hold back on the color.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. And Scott, thanks for the heads up on this one. I found dinosaurs in Montana. I shared a movie scene with Johnny Cash. I spent 2 months sailing across the Pacific on Soviet research expeditions during Glasnost and the perilous breakup of the Soviet Union. I'm a professional musician. I've served 5 years in a city fire department. I've named a new species. It was a fossil fish. I set a track and field record at my high school in Palo Alto, and I'm happy to be here today.
Well, Pat, we're happy you're here with us today as well. Let's talk about your NHD videos. NHD Academy was launched back in 2016 with your California Disclosure video series. What was that about, and why did you decide to produce it?
Well, our disclosure products go back 45 years. That's when we issued the first NHD report. Since then, the report's become well known for its educational value, explaining the hazards in a way that agents and sellers understand what they're disclosing and buyers understand what they're reading. But with technology and generational changes coming into the 21st century, it became clear that younger customers wanted video education too. So I wrote and produced a 9-episode video series that plainly explains the geologic hazard disclosures required by state law, earthquake fault zones, liquefaction zones, FEMA special flood hazard areas, and CAL FIRE's fire hazard severity zones, and so forth. We call the training our NHD Academy video series, and you can find it by going to our website, fanhd.com or disclosures.com, and clicking the training videos link in the top menu, and there you're going to find all the episodes. So when the pandemic came along, it reinforced the wisdom of making a video series, since agents could still access that training while working from home. And just as an aside, we needed some theme music to play over the introductory title screens and the credit roll for each episode. So I also wrote and performed the guitar music that you hear on those videos.
So, Pat, in your humble opinion, which of your video episodes is the most important? And please tell us why you think so.
Well, without question, the most important, in my opinion, in this series is episode 9. It's about county and city general plan disclosures. The local level is where the action is right now, and that's where it's going to remain for the foreseeable future. Most of our cities are already pretty built out, and they have to adapt to natural hazards that are only now being recognized within their city limits. So, for example, lately there's been a lot of concern about AB 38 and local vegetation management ordinances and requirements for defensible space and wildfire disclosures. Well, the official general plan of every county and city is full of many more local hazard zones, and the buyer also needs to know about those too.
So, Pat, for the benefit of our viewers, what exactly is the general plan?
Okay, so the general plan, it's a master planning document for local government. It's like a blueprint that defines how a county or a city's districts and neighborhoods will grow and develop. The general plan sets the policies that guide the jurisdiction's future development. So in order to grow safely, the local planners have to identify local hazards, earthquake faults, landslides, flood and fire zones, and other hazards within the boundaries of their community. And then they have to avoid those hazards through planning and zoning and the building permit process. And those local hazards are identified and mapped out in a chapter of the general plan called the safety element.
So, the safety element is like an inventory of official hazard zones that are mapped by the county or city government.
Exactly. Details about local faults and local landslides and local flood and fire zones, local hazards lurking right in the city's own backyard. And those local zones can be very granular and mapped in high detail by the local jurisdiction. And they typically differ from the more generalized regional hazard zones that we disclose under state law. So it's critical that a buyer find out about those local hazard zones right along with the state level zones before the close of escrow.
And Pat, why is that so important?
Why? Because local hazard zones are where the rubber meets the road. Those local hazards can torpedo a buyer's dream for a remodel or room addition or pool or a deck. And that's because any local hazard that threatens a project has to be mitigated before a county or city building department will approve your permit. And that could mean an on-site geologic report, stronger design to a stiffer code, more lumber, thicker concrete, a bigger retaining wall, and so on. And all that can multiply the cost of that remodel or pool or deck. And if those local hazards can't be mitigated, the county or city can deny the building permit. And you don't want a new buyer finding out about those local hazards at the permit counter. So it's critical that your NHD report include disclosures from the general plan safety element.
So, how does a buyer know if the NHD report includes safety element disclosures?
Well, if you're the agent, ask yourself, is the NHD provider being fully upfront and transparent about what they disclose? As you probably know, the NHD industry is not regulated, not like title companies or banks or property insurance companies. The fact is, most NHD providers conceal or mask their sources. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, would you trust your pharmacy if your prescription bottle was labeled, "Don't worry about what's in these meds, just take our word for it"? No, your pharmacy would never do that, and neither should your disclosure report. So here's the deal. The only way to authenticate safety element disclosures in your NHD report is to make sure each local disclosure is labeled with the name of the general plan and its safety element, with the date of the safety element, when it was adopted or last updated by the city council or the county board of supervisors, and the specific map number and map name in the safety element that each local disclosure relies on. You shouldn't have to play 20 questions with your NHD account rep to figure out the source of the disclosure information that your seller is giving to the buyer. The First American and JCPLGS report tells your buyer exactly what's being disclosed and where it can be verified in case the buyer challenges you or you need to defend the facts that you're disclosing. We've been disclosing from local safety elements for the last 40 years. We see them all, safety elements from 480 cities and 58 counties, and we continuously monitor all of them for updates. And we're the only disclosure company with that truly local NHD heritage.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. So you said the local level is where the action is right now, and that's where the action will remain for the foreseeable future. So where are you going with that?
Well, those local disclosures are more important now than ever before, with the impacts of rising sea level, tidal flooding, and increasing storm intensities along the coast, and with multiplying megafires in California's mountain forests and urban wildlands, and with the enforcement of defensible space and local vegetation management laws. It's a local problem when local hazards prevent homeowners from finding affordable property insurance to protect the collateral needed to qualify for a mortgage.
So it sounds like you're referring to climate change. How is that related to the general plan?
Yes, this is the most important leap in the evolution of the safety element since California passed its general plan law a half century ago. A few years ago in 2015, the governor approved Senate Bill 379. Write that down, it's very important. Senate Bill 379 passed in 2015. It forced California's counties and cities to do three things: identify climate-related natural hazards within their jurisdiction, assess the vulnerability of neighborhoods and public infrastructure to those climate hazards, and update the safety element with plans and policies for addressing those future climate impacts. So identify, assess, and update for hazards related to climate change. Well, the updated safety element then becomes a report to the local taxpayers that forecasts local climate-related impacts and explains how the county or the city will handle them. This 2015 law, SB 379, became effective in 2017, and it gave local jurisdictions about 5 years to complete their vulnerability assessments and to update their safety element. And as a result, we're now seeing an explosion of safety element updates. And remember, we see them all. Nearly every safety element that's been updated since 2020 now contains a new section focused on climate change and sea level rise impacts. And when I say explosion of updates, this is what we're seeing. Let me quickly share my screen here. Okay, so here's the timeline. The chart shows the number of cities or counties each year that updated their safety element to include an assessment of local climate-related hazards. In 2015, SB 379 becomes law. In 2017, the law takes effect. And in 2018 and 2019, not many updates going on. The jurisdictions were probably busy doing their vulnerability assessments right up through the first half of 2020. And then, second half of 2020, the safety element updates start their rise. In 2021, the updates now really take off. And by 2022, the explosion is well underway. Now, as we record this interview today in late September 2022, we still have a few months left in the year. And at this moment, about 75 additional local jurisdictions have their safety element update awaiting adoption by their county or city governing board. So you can see where this is heading. Hundreds of safety elements across California, all updated because of SB 379, each one with a new section that reports future climate impacts and local governments' plans for dealing with them. Plans and policies that are going to guide the local zoning and building departments in adapting to those hazards over the coming decades. So for the last 45 years, the safety elements reported local natural hazards within the county or city limits, but now these planning documents are being updated to include hazards that are caused by or worsened by climate change. Every California community is going to be impacted to some extent by some of those climate-related hazards, and the mix will depend on whether you're inland or near the coast. In coastal areas, your community's safety element might cover sea level rise associated with tidal flooding, damaging storm surges, saltwater intrusion, coastal erosion, and bluff retreat, whereas inland areas, the safety element may cover rapid snowmelt, landslides, forest infestation and tree mortality, and of course, wildfire threat. And in both areas, flash flooding, widening of floodplains, drought, extreme heat events, land subsidence from overpumping of groundwater basins, and damaging winds. And if you think about it strategically, over the coming decades, a consequence of these climate-driven hazards will likely be climate migration. Well, what is that? Residents selling out and moving to more hospitable areas with cooler weather and greater water availability, which will likely impact your inventory, demand, and home prices in some real estate markets. So in summary, this law, SB 379, has compelled counties and cities to recognize climate-related hazards and put the public on notice, and that would be you and your clients, by focusing public attention on these hazards in the local general plan safety element. And that's not a terrible thing. We know a lot of agents and brokers really want to do the right thing and address future climate change with their buyer, but they just don't know how to do it without looking like the bad guy. Well, now you can blame it on the state and on this new law, SB 379, for forcing your county and city government to identify climate-related hazards in your community and report them in your local general plan safety element, thereby making climate-related hazards too obvious to ignore.
So, Pat, over the years, your blogs and webinars have reported on the early scientific projections of climate change and how they'll impact our homes and neighborhoods. As we read in the headlines every day now, those projected climate impacts are already happening and are being exceeded in some areas. So, what do you think the biggest impact of climate change will be over the next several years?
Well, the biggest impact I see for real estate agents is the failure to disclose climate-related hazards, potential non-disclosure liability. And to see what I mean, look at what's happening in the housing economy right now. Home values skyrocketed over the last couple of years, but now interest rates are spiking, mortgage payments are going up right along with them, inflation rate is up, and those low inventories and high demand and stratospheric sale prices of the past are beginning to moderate. And many home buyers now find themselves with a giant mortgage. CNBC reports that 3/4 of recent buyers have regrets, mostly because they spent too much money. And it's times like these when a homeowner starts to think, how did I get myself into this? And how do I get myself out of this with the least damage? Sound familiar? Kind of like the 2008 housing crisis, except of course today we don't have the risky loans to unqualified buyers. Dodd-Frank fixed that. And most homeowners today still have a lot of equity to fall back on, and unemployment remains relatively low. But what was the fallout from that economic downturn? We began seeing distressed buyers looking for a way out of their huge debt. Some of them looked for defects in the contract, especially for material facts that weren't disclosed at the time of sale, and some looked for a relevant public document that wasn't disclosed by the seller. Well, today, climate change impacts are high up on the list of undisclosed hazards, and the community's long-term planning document, that safety element, which reports hazards right in my neighborhood, hazards that the local government is aware of and planning for, and that local officials are forecasting over the term of a 30-year mortgage. Well, to an aggrieved buyer, the safety element is a relevant public document, and that might become the proverbial smoking gun. And that presents a non-disclosure risk. So Scott, to answer your question, I see the potential non-disclosure of climate-related hazards as the biggest challenge facing real estate agents in the foreseeable future.
Okay, Pat, so I think I get it. To sum it up, it's not just the rise of the catastrophic wildfires that are happening for inland communities, or even the rise of sea level for coastal counties, but really climate-related threats of all kinds are confronting the California real estate industry with a new category of local natural hazard disclosure. And the buyer needs to find out about those local hazards before the close of escrow.
Exactly. California's policy framework now firmly recognizes the impact of climate change as a natural hazard that must be addressed at the local level. Well, why is that important for real estate? Because climate impacts, if ignored, become hidden costs for a new buyer. And just as we're seeing with the AB 38 wildfire disclosures, these climate-related impacts could also affect the sale price, the purchase decision, insurance and mortgage availability, and the buyer's use and enjoyment of the property. And like any other hidden cost, those hazards should be disclosed to help minimize the risk to the transaction.
Hey, thanks, Pat. Oh, we're running up against the clock. Any final thoughts before we wrap up our interview?
Well, there's a term that's been around for a while that's beginning to enter the real estate lexicon. They don't teach it in your license courses, so it's a new concept for a lot of agents. The term is the last buyer. It all comes from a simple economic theory. When an object's value becomes negative on the secondary market, the object becomes a burden rather than a benefit to its owner. You can't sell it. Nobody wants it. You'll never get back what you spent for it. And at that point, when the object has lost its resale value, the owner of record becomes the last buyer. Now, anyone who's tried selling a used crock pot on Marketplace understands this concept. They call it a porch pickup. Well, it didn't cost me that much. It's yours, free. I'll leave it on the porch. Just come pick it up and get it out of my life. For a low value object, it's no biggie. The last buyer will simply dispose of it, donate it to a charity, or just toss it in the dumpster. But for a major investment like a piece of real estate, totally different story. No longer a crock pot on Marketplace. The negative asset is now a very costly white elephant, and the owner of record probably has some regrets. So now, imagine that it's not just a single property, but a whole neighborhood of last buyers. For historical examples, think Dust Bowl towns back in the 1930s, or the fenced-off ghost towns in Los Angeles after the Northridge earthquake in the 1990s. Or a future neighborhood that becomes regularly inaccessible because of periodic tidal flooding, or becomes unlivable because of rising groundwater, or that's uninhabitable because it's permanently in the high tide zone, or a block of homes disappearing because of gradual coastal erosion, or, and this is a different kind of climate impact, the housing is no longer affordable because the city passed a 1915 Act bond district with a huge special assessment to pay for raising the levees and roadways in the neighborhood, or relocating a water treatment plant or pipelines and other critical facilities. As a practical matter, you can build retaining walls or extend seawalls or dump sand and boulders on the beach for only so long before it becomes financially unsustainable, both for the property owner and for your fellow taxpayers, or before living there becomes prohibited under safety regulations enforced by the chief building official. And at that point, you have a neighborhood of last buyers. And these are not just hypotheticals. In California, some recent examples of last buyer neighborhoods include a block of homes along West Line Drive in Daly City that the building department condemned because they were at the crest of a failing landslide. and another block of homes on Esplanade Avenue, just down the coast in the city of Pacifica, that had to be demolished before the eroding bluff collapsed out from under them. Or certain beach properties along coastal California that become periodically inundated by overflowing tides and extreme storm surges. So what's in the forecast? According to a new study published just last month, these are real possible futures under a changing climate. Over the next 30 years, the study concludes that nearly 650,000 individual privately owned parcels in the US are projected to fall below coastal tidal boundaries by 2050. That could mean a lot of last buyer neighborhoods threatened by sea level rise and other climate-related hazards within the span of an existing 30-year mortgage. So the last buyer, the person or the corporation stuck holding the bag when a property has lost its value. We're going to be hearing a lot more about the last buyer over the coming decades as climate impacts worsen. And rest assured, the insurance and mortgage industries are getting hip to this concept, and they don't want to be the last buyer. And one last point about this. It's important to understand that a home threatened by climate-related hazards can become unlivable long before it becomes uninhabitable. And that's the economic impact that produces the last buyer in real estate. If it's not livable, it's not profitable.
So what happens to the seller and agent who sold the property to the last buyer?
Yeah, right? Property owner's not going to be overjoyed to discover he's the last buyer. He'll probably want to be made whole, and so somebody's going to pay. And then everybody starts lawyering up. I guess we could call that situation the last buyer syndrome. I might have just made that up. The aggrieved property owner looks for something left out of the contract that was material to the purchase decision or the price paid. So what's the defect? Well, you didn't specifically tell me about sea level rise or worsening storm surge or bluff retreat or increasing wildfire threats or risks from broader floodplains. There's a lot to choose from in the safety element.
Okay, fair enough. But sea level rise mostly affects just the East Coast and Gulf Coast, not so much in California, right?
Well, yeah, we certainly do see headlines every day about sea level rise along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts and how tidal flooding is increasing in those regions. For real estate companies here in California, if they're doing business in those regions, then they're probably dealing right now with those climate-related hazards in their eastern and southern U.S. markets. But is it affecting California? Well, our flood maps, FEMA's special flood hazard areas, they haven't yet been updated to account for climate change. But private insurance companies in California are updating their wildfire risk maps, modeling climate change so they can better forecast their future claims. And the mortgages that California home buyers depend on, just this year, federal regulators put the mortgage industry on notice that they now expect major lenders to factor the financial risks posed by climate change into their Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac decision making. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Getting back to your question, here on the West Coast, we're also seeing impacts of climate change and sea level rise. Just last month, a hurricane moved up along the Southern California coast. Its storm surge on top of tidal flooding, on top of sea level rise, pushed the surf zone right up to the sandbags around homes and businesses in Orange, LA, and Ventura counties, in beach towns like Long Beach and Seal Beach and Huntington Beach, for example. And that, by the way, was at the same time that disastrous wildfires and flash flooding were happening elsewhere in California, along with a statewide record heat wave. Now, I need to clarify that with a little bit of review from my past webinars on this topic. So just like along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, flooding along the West Coast is also worsening because sea level is rising worldwide. Why? Two key words: water and temperature. Glaciers and ice caps on land are melting and adding fresh water to the ocean basins. And the ocean surface is growing warmer, and that warming seawater expands and takes up more space. So the added fresh water and the expanding warmer seawater makes the oceans larger and sea level higher. Okay, that's a lot. Let's unpack that with a little bit of context here. Global sea level rose about 1 foot over the last century, and it's projected to rise another foot by the year 2050. Think about that. That's a century's worth of sea level rise over just the next 30 years. So sea level rise is actually accelerating. And that rate of sea level rise shows no sign of slowing down or reversing. So climate-related hazards are the new normal, and they're going to get worse before they get better. So what are we doing about it? By no means is California ignoring the problem. All over the state, local governments are adapting to the climate threat. Dikes are being raised along the San Francisco Bay to protect neighborhoods from sea level rise. Levees are being elevated and strengthened in the Central Valley. Dams are being upgraded with higher floodgates in order to store water and also be able to safely release runoff from extreme storms or from sudden snowmelt. Some cities have banned construction in areas threatened by tidal flooding, and other cities are hiking local taxes to pay for protecting public infrastructure from chronic flooding and saltwater intrusion. And we're now seeing local laws and regulations that require abatement of dangerous property in areas that are declared to be coastal hazard zones. However, adapting to climate change is not without controversy. Adaptation presents some pretty complicated practical and political issues at the local level. Some cities are beginning to buy back private property located in hazard zones, compensating the owner for taking the property. And local taxpayers are asking, is that really how we want to spend our tax dollars, buying property that nature has condemned? Well, the big answer to your question, Scott, is yes, sea level rise and other climate change impacts are definitely happening along the West Coast and right here in California. And as I already mentioned, they're not just coastal. Climate change cascades into broader impacts that affect every region of the state.
Okay, Pat, tell us, what can a real estate agent or broker do to protect themselves from the last buyer syndrome?
Well, full disclosure here, I'm not a real estate agent. In my line of work, I'm a geologist. Our time horizon is a bit longer than yours. It's not just a year or a real estate boom and bust cycle or a career. We think about hazards in terms of what we call deep time. So I'm going to nerd out on you for just a moment here to make an important point. Sea cliffs have been crumbling for as long as oceans have existed. That's about 4 billion years since the Precambrian era. And wildlands have been burning for as long as forests have been around. That's about 400 million years since the Devonian period. And homes and habitats have been destroyed and recycled for as long as people have been on the planet, since the middle of the Pleistocene Ice Age, about the last 400,000 years or so, depending on the earliest human species that you recognize. And so with that deep perspective, we understand that nature doesn't give a whit about ocean views or forested skylines or streamside charm or affordable HOA fees. Private property is not permanent, and nature is coming to repossess it sooner or later. But here's the problem. Nature is doing it faster now than at any time in the last 1 million years. In just the last century, atmospheric carbon dioxide has spiked to its highest level in the past million years. And that's not just a theory. It's based on mile-long ice cores drilled down through the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, minute layers of ice like pages in a diary that have trapped chemical evidence of prehistoric climate change. Well, so what, right? Well, so CO2 is the planet's most abundant greenhouse gas. As it builds up in the atmosphere, it traps heat at the Earth's surface. So along with that spiking CO2, the evidence also shows that global climate is warming now faster than at any time since humans first appeared. And that warming is fastest at the North and South poles. And forgive me for repeating myself. That global warming is melting land ice and heating the ocean surface, which together causes sea level rise, along with the spectrum of climate-related hazards that I've already talked too much about. Hazards that were unusual in the past, but are now becoming more common. Well, unfortunately, because of humanity's short time horizon, measured by the length of a career or a lifetime, we didn't see this crisis coming. And we built our neighborhoods right in the path of those climate hazards. So thanks to SB 379, those are the hazards that your counties and cities are now planning for and dealing with in their general plan safety element. So Scott, to your question, how do you protect yourself against the risk of selling a property to the last buyer? As real estate associations have been counseling us our entire careers, when in doubt, disclose, disclose, disclose. Make sure that all your buyers understand the new facts about climate change that are now being reported in the safety element. So, okay, the next question is, but how do I disclose climate hazards simply and clearly? Provide your buyer with an NHD report that includes straightforward and transparent disclosures from the safety element. And again, how do you know you're getting reliable safety element disclosures? Your NHD report should specify the name of the general plan and the safety element that the disclosures rely on, the date that the city council or the county board of supervisors adopted or last updated the safety element, the name and the number of the specific map in the safety element that each local disclosure is based on. And then make sure your NHD report explains each local disclosure in language that a buyer can understand. And while there's no guarantee that you'll never be sued, disclosing local natural hazards from the county and city safety element will help you defend yourself, your company, and your clients from the dreaded last buyer syndrome. And if you have any questions about the safety element disclosures in the First American or JCP-LGS reports, please ask our sales representative in your area to show you a sample of the report and walk you through it.
Patrick McClellan, geologist for First American NHD and JCP-LGS. Thank you very much for joining us in the NHD Academy's Camp Out 2022.
Okay. Hey, Scott, I see you over there. I think I'm up next here, just trying to figure out how to see myself. There I am. Okay. Hey, everybody, Pat McClellan again. Thanks for watching our video with Scott Fairbanks. I know there's a lot of stuff there, pretty dense. So if you want the facts behind a lot of that stuff that was on the video, we have some links for you. Those facts were presented a couple of years ago in the CAR Expo webinars that we produced, and we'll send those links out to you after this presentation here. But a couple of things that I want to clarify for you in a few slides that I want to show right now. This whole concept of the last buyer, I know it kind of sounds far-fetched, but what I want to do is show you some real life examples of these last buyer neighborhoods that are a real thing right here in California. And then after those slides, I want to show you an example of one of these recently updated general plan safety elements and the new section on climate change that it includes. includes, and then finally, how we deliver that information in our First American NHD and JCPLGS NHD reports. So let me share my screen and get right to these slides here for you. There we go. I want to begin with some illustrations of what I've already talked about in this interview webinar. What you see in these two slides is a subdivision in Daly City. I mentioned it on the webinar, Westline Drive. It's a street within this division or subdivision called the Skyline subdivisions. Daly City is the city just south of San Francisco, right along the coast. In the black and white image to the left, you can see in the lower half of the view here, that's the Skyline subdivision. Back in those days, there was no Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zone Act, which required setbacks from an active fault. So this subdivision is bisected by the San Andreas Fault. And then where that fault goes out to shore, after millions of years of slipping, the fault has pulverized the bedrock here and weakened it to the point where there is now a huge landslide complex, and the builder at the time was allowed to develop that subdivision right up to the edge of the landslide. And so what you can see now, that red arrow on the left points to Westline Drive, and on the right there is the same Westline Drive, and I'm going to zoom in on that to show you what's happened in the 70 years or so since this subdivision was developed. Here is a portion of that subdivision. Westline Drive, you can see, is now only half a block long because about 36 of these homes have been condemned and removed as a result of this landslide growing into the subdivision. So here we have about 36 last buyers in this last buyer neighborhood. I also mentioned Esplanade Avenue in Pacifica. And this is what that subdivision looked like just as it was getting started back in the 1970s. Esplanade Drive on both sides has apartment complexes. One of them on the coast side has a sort of a strip of flat ground. You can see it's called the Natural Terrace in this slide right here. Well, that Natural Terrace was wider than those buildings back when this subdivision was first developed. And then below the terrace is the steep sea cliff, and at the bottom of the cliff is the beach, the gray area that you see along the bottom of this slide here. We're going to move forward through time from 1972 going up 30 years to 2003, and you'll notice that there's not much change in this subdivision or the sea cliff here. That dark brown terrace that you see is still there. It is unaffected by time and aging. But as we go only 9 years forward from 2003 to 2009, we noticed that there suddenly is some huge amount of erosion, coastal erosion going on here, and the sea cliff has eaten back toward these apartment complexes. And the owner has placed boulders along the base of the sea cliff to slow down the erosion. That's called riprap, and we'll hear more about that a little bit later. And then moving forward just another 4 years to 2013, you'll notice there's no more of that terrace left because the bluff has eaten its way right back to the balconies and patios of these apartment complexes. And notice the riprap is now extended all along the base of the sea cliff, trying to protect it. Well, one of the benefits of a beach, a sandy beach, is that it cushions the surf as it pounds against a sea cliff here. Well, when you put rocky riprap along the base of a sea cliff, it's a different situation. Those rocks reflect the energy of the crashing surf back into the water, and that energy is transmitted down the coast to the neighboring property. And you can see on the right side of this view right here, the neighbor has protected its bluff by coating it in concrete, trying to resist those transferred forces of the surf here. Well, we're going to move forward a couple of years now to 2015, and this is what the Esplanade Avenue apartment complexes looked like. The bluff had retreated back underneath the foundations of these buildings. At this point, one of those apartment complexes was deemed to be uninhabitable, and the city moved people out of the building. And then within 6 months, the other apartment complex was also condemned, and it was vacated as well. And by that point, the commercial property owner had declared bankruptcy, and there was nothing left except for the city to demolish these buildings. And so, using taxpayer dollars, about $300,000, these buildings were demolished before they fell onto the public beach below. And what is left today along Esplanade Avenue it's a one-sided street now. Here you see the pads where these three actually apartment buildings used to stand, and the ocean views now are enjoyed by the apartments on the other side of Esplanade Avenue. But you can see where this is all going to go over the course of the next decades, is that the coast will consider, pardon me, the bluffs will continue to retreat toward those other developed parts of the neighborhood. So those are coastal landslides. On the interior of the San Francisco Peninsula, we have situations like this one here. Back in 1997 and 98, a very strong El Nino caused lots of intense rains that triggered landslides along the peninsula. And this is a landslide in the little community of La Honda. The hillside gave way and took with it about a dozen properties like this one here. And those now become last buyer properties. You can't rebuild on a landslide here because of the ever-present danger of it continuing to slide. And another example of a landslide. This one, the homes, the neighborhood was not actually on the landslide, but below it. And this is one that folks in Southern California may be familiar with, the La Conchita landslide between on the coastal strip between Ventura and Santa Barbara. It came down and actually buried part of the neighborhood here. There were a couple of dozen homes that were crushed or otherwise destroyed, and 10 fatalities as well. So here we have another example of a last buyer neighborhood in coastal Southern California. This is a little bit different kind of a last buyer neighborhood. It's actually in San Bernardino County, in the Mojave Desert, not far from Barstow, where sand from the Mojave River floodplain was picked up by winds and just driven into town and buried neighborhoods in this part of Newberry Springs. So some of you down there may have heard about this situation here. So most of these coastal scenes that I've talked about have been in Northern California, but it's the same along the Southern California coast as well. 5 years ago, the U.S. Geological Survey studied the sea cliffs along Southern California. They determined that sea cliff erosion is happening at about the same rate down there as it is up here in Northern California. And that rate is an average of 1.5 to 2 feet of bluff retreat over the course of a single year. So what they concluded was that over the next 70 years, before the end of this century, that coastal bluffs could retreat by as much as 135 feet. And that's a lot of land for a small parcel out at the edge of the sea cliff here. Typically, we determine how much the bluff retreat will be by multiplying this annual rate, 1.5 to 2 feet per year, times the number of years in the design life of the structure. So we'll just say over 30 years of a mortgage, that's going to be about 50 or 60 feet of coastal retreat. And over a half century, that could be 60 or 70 feet or so. And by the end of this current century, as they concluded, 135 feet. So if you were the owner of this house in the picture here, and you bought the property to bequeath to your grandkids, chances are the house and much of the property won't even be there by the time your grandkids are old enough to receive it. Okay, so let's move on to the general plan safety element. This is one that was updated just a few years ago, 2019. It's the City of Burlingame's general plan, and I'm showing you a page out of the community safety element here. And then what you can see in the center here is their section, brand new, added in 2019, that documents the extent of sea level rise that's anticipated over the coming decades that this community has to plan for. And in this safety element, they include a map here on the lower right that shows the extent of flooding that's expected from gradual sea level rise over the course of the next 30 to 50 years toward the end of the century here. Now, how we present that in our report is we document the name of the general plan, the date that it was adopted, in this case, updated in 2019, and the name of the map that we base our determination on. This is figure CS-4, the anticipated sea level rise map. And then we come down and in addition to the other natural hazards from the general plan, we now disclose this new hazard of sea level rise. And just quoting here, water levels in San Francisco Bay have risen over 8 inches since the early 20th century, and because of the effects of climate change, are predicted to continue rising at a faster rate. So this is what the city is reporting to its taxpayers. And we explain the hazard in the report using the language that is used in the safety element. The city will become increasingly vulnerable to water inundation during both normal high tides and during major storm events. Rising sea levels may inundate the land along the bayfront and flood nearby industrial, commercial, and residential areas. And then we provide the property determination based on the location of the parcel. In this case, in shall be reported if any portion of the property is located within a mapped area of anticipated sea level rise as depicted in this public record. So that's how we report these climate-related natural hazards that are now being included in city and county safety elements as a result of this SB 379 law that was passed 5 or 6 years ago. Okay, so as to the question of how to respond to climate-related hazards, well, we can break it down. There are a couple of different categories, I suppose. Sudden events like floods, wildfires, and landslides. Well, we've had sudden natural disasters like this before, except they're going to become more common according to scientific predictions. How did we deal with those in the past? That's how we're going to deal with them in the future. You can prepare your family for these disasters, get a go bag together, keep it by the front door. You can download these preparedness guides from the FEMA website or the California Office of Emergency Services website. Get some emergency training, first aid, CPR, or even search and rescue training from your local fire department, or buy hazard insurance as a way of underwriting your potential loss there. But then there are these other kinds of climate hazards, the slow rise events that include sea level rise, droughts, extreme heat. These are hazards that happen so slowly, it's almost imperceptible over the course of years or decades. And local planners identify or recognize several different levels of reaction or response to these slow rise climate related hazards: protection, accommodation, and managed retreat. Protection would include piling up boulders along the sea cliff or building a seawall along the coast, elevating dikes to prevent overtopping by tidal flooding, or putting a dam upstream to minimize the risk of flooding during intense damaging rainfalls. Accommodation means letting nature do what nature wants to do here, and designing your community, planning it around where these hazards are going to exist. And then trying to work with nature to prevent the hazards from getting into your developed areas. One way is what's called beach nourishment, hauling in thousands of truckloads of sand to replenish the beach that cushions the surf out there. Elevating buildings above the high tide levels, planting urban forests to help keep the neighborhoods cool during these extreme heat events. And then in the case of this drifting sand example that I showed you, continual grading of the roadways to keep access open to these threatened communities. So those are the accommodation strategies for dealing with some of these climate change hazards. The third level of response, managed retreat, is the most contentious of all because it requires local decision makers to decide how to best balance public safety with the benefit that everyone in the community will receive as a result of investments in hazard management and mitigation. And these could include limiting new construction in hazardous areas, prohibiting construction, for example. In severe cases, as in Daly City, for example, and Esplanade Avenue in Pacifica, severe cases would include removing vulnerable construction in the hazard zone so that it doesn't threaten public safety. And then also spending tax dollars to buy out threatened property and abandon this property and move people back into safety again. So those would be the slow rise events and local responses to them. But for the broker and agent, the immediate response is to be sure you provide your buyer with authenticated climate hazard disclosures in your NHD report. And again, that's a disclosure that includes the name of the local general plan safety element, the date it was adopted or last updated, identification of the safety element map that was used for the property determination, the map name and the map number, and a clear and simple explanation of these climate-related hazards. But again, the safety element is only a starting point. If your sale property has some clear hazards that your buyer needs to know more about, the low-priced NHD report should not be considered a substitute for an on-site geologic investigation or engineering investigation by a licensed professional. So for site-specific advice, always consult an appropriate professional. So we're going to forego the questions just to give everybody a chance to prepare for the next presentation here. But please, we encourage and invite your questions. Submit them offline after my presentation to pmcclellan@firstam.com and put the word campout somewhere in the subject line so I'm sure not to miss them. And so with that, I'm going to stop my share here and turn the time back over to Scott Fairbanks, who will wind us out of this particular segment of Campout. Scott, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. I know we're short on time, so I'll just appreciate everyone joining us today, and Pat, for your wealth of knowledge and experience and sharing that with us. We're very grateful. We hope everyone joins us for our remaining sessions of Camp Out this year. Again, thank you, and hope you enjoy and find value in these presentations. Everyone take care. Have a wonderful day.